Karl Marx's social conflict theory. Now, firstly, we will be talking about the type of theory that the social conflict theory is. The social conflict theory developed by Karl Marx is considered a macro theory. This is because Marx used this theory to analyze the interactions between society and the institutions it is exposed to in a wide sense. Now, more specifically, how different groups in society interact with institutions that are involved with things like money, education, family, and even social status in terms of competing for power is really studied in this theory, making the theory a macro theory in sociology. This theory looks at the structure of society that is based on power competition as a whole and does not really empathize with the relationships of individual families in the society being studied and how they affect social institutions. And that's why it's not really a micro theory. As this presentation continues, you will really get to see how social conflict theory studies broader aspects around social institutions that affect and constitute a society as a whole.
Human behavior and the conflict theory. So we know that the conflict theory pretty much relates to the wealthy taking advantage of the poor in some way, and these people usually hold lots of power, money, and are very dominant in the world, and because of this, they usually show very competitive behavior. And this pretty much means that these people will go to any extent and do anything to maintain their power. They also show very deviant behaviors, which is usually something meaning that they don't meet social institutions and they will violate social norms as long as it gives them some sort of benefit or like advantage to them in any single way. And since they have so much power in their hands, it's common for them to abuse this power and get away with it as well. They can abuse their power to break laws and do things that aren't deemed to be ethical, and even use their power for the oppression of people. Overall, this theory just kind of tells you how inconsiderate and selfish the rich can be towards people. They'll display violent behavior to get their way out of other people. A real life example of the conflict theory and human behavior was the incident in Bangladesh in 2013 known as the Dhaka garment factory collapse in Rana Plaza. These factories are basically just sweatshops and is pretty much known as modern day slavery. Many big brands operated here like Walmart and even Children's Place. The building collapsed due to the building being extremely unsafe, and it also had poor engineering and the building was overall just falling apart. The working conditions were extremely bad for the workers and there are no safety precautions set either. Even after receiving many warnings from safety officers that the building was not safe to work in, the owner ignored the warnings and he signed off the building standards and forced the employees to continue to work under horrible conditions. The building collapsed and killed thousands of people. The owner abused his power and kept everyone's mouth shut, which is known as economical oppression. He took advantage by suppressing the poor and powerless to make money, which is selfish, inconsiderate, and even displaying deviant behavior by breaking multiple social norms.
The major concepts, ideas, and terminology used to explain the social conflict theory. So we've all heard of the word competition, right? Well, that's a term used quite oftenly in this theory while explaining this theory, because it is something that is constantly occurring in society today. Humans tend to compete with each other when they do not have sufficient items, like materialistic items, which include money, property, commodities, or even unmaterialistic items like dominance, social status, or intelligence. The social conflict theory's main idea is that society can only function efficiently by conflict and power, not by agreement or conformity. Moreover, class conflicts is another term that Karl Marx has used quite a lot when creating this theory, because Marx believed that society is made up of two social classes, which are the bourgeois, the capitalists, the wealthy people, and the proletariat, which are the unfortunate, the poor, and the working class. Since both of these classes have different goals and views in life, it normally results in a clash. And that happens because one group of people receives more resources while the other does not. And due to the unfairness, a conflict arises. Structural inequality has also been quite majorly used when explaining this theory since it relates back to class conflicts because one group of people here receive more power compared to the other. There have been many instances in society where inequality has occurred, whether that is at home or in the workplace or at school. But this idea mainly speaks about how certain groups are more dominant than others due to the factors of their personality or identity. The ones that do have this power do not let it slip or be taken away. They maintain it and hold on to it, and even expand it. They don't want their power to be taken away by any lower class individual since they do know the value of this power. However, there are times when conflicts get so increased and so crazy that only war can solve that issue. By having a war, we all do get united in some ways, but conflict still exists in society every day. Lastly, global capitalism is a recent term used to define the idea of upper class people controlling the whole world. And that is because only a very only a very few amount of wealthy people in today's world actually have the total control of our entire resources and how everyone actually gets everything. It's just the 1% of the wealthiest people in the world that's controlling everyone. That's not fair at all because that takes away a lot of people's resources that they need, and only the rich keep getting it, which makes the rich richer forever, while it creates more and more poverty rates for everyone else, which is definitely not fair. And this is why they suppress the poor.
Negative aspects and disadvantages of the conflict theory. So even the conflict theory has many negatives and disadvantages. The first major one is that the conflict theory seems to always hold a negative image on society, which isn't 100% accurate. It challenges the status quo, and the theory basically states that the most powerful or elite people are the most responsible to hold social order in society. And it also identifies acts of kindness as someone who might have an ulterior motive, or someone wants something out of you, and that's the only reason they're doing that act of kindness, which is obviously not 100% accurate as well. And they also identify any humanitarian effort as a way to control people by the masses or large amounts. And the second point is that the theory has a disadvantage in that it can't be applied to all environments and situations, like at home and the family and social equality situations, and can only be applied to situations like war, politics, and famine. And the biggest flaw is probably that the theory doesn't recognize that economic interactions can be useful or beneficial. It only labels them as something that is negative, which isn't entirely true.
I'll be talking about the examples of negative aspects and the disadvantages. I think that one of the main disadvantages of the conflict theory is for the less fortunate. I think that the theory ascertains a system as the best way of spreading wealth across a society. I also feel institutions that practice conflict theory often establish welfare, either by direct subsidize or tax breaks in support of large firms. I also think that the conflict theory underestimates the ability of people to grow economically, and the poor individuals within the society have to wait for government aid rather than exploring other alternatives to live a decent life. Now, I'll be moving on to the conflict theory and individual development. I'll be talking about how conflict theory affects an individual's development. So, I feel that a common belief of conflict theory is that human relationships and social structures experience inequalities of power. Like, an important assumption of conflict theory is that human relationships and social structures all experience inequalities of power, and in this way, some individuals and groups inherently develop more power and reward than others. I also feel the conflict theory always indicates that due to society's never-ending competition for finite resources, there will always be a state of conflict. Now I'll be giving an example of how conflict theory affects an individual's development. I feel that according to the conflict theory, individuals and groups within society will try to make the best use of their wealth and power. I feel like the conflict theory sees society and socialization in a very different way. Instead of focusing on cohesion as the foundation of society, conflict theorists suggest that human behavior and social relations result from underlying conflicts that exist between competing groups. That's why I feel the conflict theory includes competition, structural inequality, revolution, and war. The conflict theory also includes pay inequalities between groups and inequalities in the justice and educational systems of governments.
Now, moving on to a real life example. In this example, there are going to be two parts. I will be talking about the wage gap between men and women, and I got the information from a research article produced by Pew Research Center, and I will be also talking about the bourgeoisie and proletariat conflict, which I got the information mainly from Khan Academy. A strong example of the concepts of this theory in play can really be shown when we compare the conflict between the bourgeoisie people and the proletariat group of people in the 19th century, and also the men and women in today's society. Karl Marx observed that the bourgeoisie people had a higher status than the proletariat people and thus held more power in society. The bourgeoisie people used their power to exploit the proletariat people for their labor in the factories they ran. The proles were underpaid and oppressed, and so they protested for this cause. They started to push for power in the factory institutions they worked in. The economy and overall society was kind of structured based on this power competition, as proletariats were forced to work in the factories even though they were underpaid to maintain their basic needs. While on the other hand, the bourgeoisie people used their power over the proles to maintain profit, which was their own needs. Even in today's day and age, in comparison, men hold higher statuses and power than women when it comes to earning the same for the same job. Men use their power in society to maintain the wage gap, and so they exploit the labor of women in this way. Therefore, women protest so that they can get power in the salary competition when it comes to working in the same institutions. We can really see that in the structure of today's society and economy, men abuse their power all over the world to make more than women for their needs, and women protest for equal pay to sustain their own lives. We can clearly see parallels in the bourgeoisie versus proletariat and men versus women conflicts I have talked about. The bourgeoisie people and men in today's society hold higher statuses and abuse their power, while the proletariats and women protest against the inequalities to gain some power. So we can see here how there's still a power competition. Both conflicts involve unfairness when it comes to institutions involving work, money, and as I talked about, even social status.
So this is a real life example of conflict theory happening in real life right now. And this is about the Uyghur Muslims facing exploitation in China. So I took this article from CBC News, and it's basically talking about how the Chinese government is marginalizing Uyghur Muslims, and they're taking away all of their ethnicity, their religion, and cultural background, their traditions, everything away from them, and saying that you can't do any of this. You can only and only follow Chinese culture because they're living on their land in China, and they expect them to only do everything that a Chinese would, and none of anyone else's cultures or traditions are allowed here. And they want to keep their superiority, they want to keep their social status, and this is why they do it.